everyone and welcome. Valentine's Day is just around the corner, so I thought that this would be the perfect time to talk about some of my favorite romances in the fantasy books that I've read. Some of these books are full-blown fantasy romance books where the romance plot is the main plot and the entire book is built upon this. Others are your average fantasy books where you do have a romance subplot that I greatly enjoyed. So I will try to make sure for each and every of the books that I mention that I also mention the degree of romance and how important it is for the overall plot. And I will also try to mention the amount of smut. But to be honest, most of the books that I read are not that smut heavy. Now, we do have quite a bit of books to get through, so without further ado, let's get into them. And the first book that I'm going to recommend is definitely not a fantasy romance. It's an historical fantasy that takes place in early medieval England, but it does have some romance subplots that I greatly enjoyed. And that is Sister Song by Lucy Holland. So this is a retelling of the Ballad of the Trois Sisters, and in this one we follow the three sisters who are also the daughters of the king. Now, this is a book that revolves around the old faith versus the new. You have nature-based magic, all of that. But the reason why it's on the list is because it does have two romances that I quite enjoyed. We have an LGBTQ plus romance, which of course is always nice to have representation. But we also have a romance between one of the sisters and Tristan, who is a very mysterious young man. And what I quite enjoyed here is that throughout the entire book, you don't know if Tristan is to be trusted or not. And I really liked that sense of tension, that you actually don't know if you're supposed to root for this romance, because you don't know how it's going to end up. So without spoiling any of the endings here, if any of this sounds interesting, then I would highly recommend this, especially if you don't like to have a too heavy romance plot in your fantasy books. I think that this is a great one. Next up, I have a book that is very heavy on the romance plot, and I would dare to call this a fantasy romance even though I'm not quite sure if it's officially in that subgenre. And that is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. This is a January 2022 new release, and I absolutely loved the romance in this one. In this Chinese myth retelling, we follow the daughter of the moon goddess. She is on a quest to save her mother, but along the way she meets a lot of new and interesting people. This has both a friends to lovers trope as well as a love triangle trope, and especially that second one I think is masterfully handled here, because I'm not the biggest fan of that trope and I loved it in this book. So highly recommend this, especially if you're looking for a sweet romance, because I think that for some people this book might be a little bit too sweet. For me it was perfect, especially to read around Valentine's Day. Highly recommend. Next up, I have a series that definitely doesn't have romance as its main plot, but that is the sole reason why I'm still reading it, because I really love that romance just so much. And that is the Night Runner series by Lynn Llewellyn. Now, full transparency, I have only read the first 3 books at this point, and the third book was a massive disappointment, up to the point that it made it to my most disappointing books of 2021 list. However, I have heard from everybody, including people who absolutely love this series, that the third book is just bad and that it gets a lot better after that. So I'm definitely still going to continue. This is an epic fantasy series. You have elves, you have centaurs, you have mages, you have quite a bit of political intrigue. That's all fine. I'm reading this for the two main characters, Alec and Sergil, who are a spy duo but also lovers. And in the first book, this one, you see how they meet each other, and it's definitely a slow burn romance where you only have the romance in the second book, to be honest, but it's just so heartwarming to see how these two people interact with each other and to see this romance blossoming. So I just want to read more about that, and I have heard that we see more in the later books of the series, especially for this gay couple, how some things are difficult, such as having children, especially in this fantasy world. So I do want to see how Lynn Llewellyn tackles these subjects, and I do also think that if anything about this sounds interesting to you, you will probably really like this series. Now, like I said, I don't think that the political intrigue here is the best I've ever read about, but these two main characters, you're just going to love them. Next up, I have 2 sapphic romances to recommend. And the first one is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El Motar and Max Gladstone. Now, yes, this is sci-fi, but to be honest, in its core, it's really a sapphic romance story, and they chose a decor of sci-fi. They could have chosen anything else. In this book, we follow 2 agents on opposite sides of a time war, and they are often sent back in time to change just a small thing that will then make them win the war in the end. They notice that these 2 people are often sent to the same place, and they start leaving notes for one another. In the beginning, these are just teasing notes. In the end, these turn into love letters. Now, these love letters are the ones that we are reading in this small novella. I do think that this is not the book for everybody. This is very purple prose, it's almost poetic, and it's not the run-of-the-mill romance or the romance that you would expect, because these 2 people almost barely meet in this entire book. You're reading their love letters to one another. So it's definitely not for everyone, but if anything of this sounds interesting to you, I would highly recommend just giving it a chance. Then the next one is The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. This is the first one in the Magic of the Lost trilogy. The second one is finished, if I'm not mistaken, and the author is currently working on the third one. So even though this is the only one out, I do think that the trilogy will be completed in the next couple of years. This is not a fantasy romance. This is a colonial fantasy, but it does have a sapphic romance element that I quite enjoyed. In this book, we follow two main characters. We follow Terrain, who is a grown woman now. She is fighting in the Imperial Army, but she was a child soldier. And she is sent to the colony where she was originally from to help squash a rebellion. On the other hand, we follow Luca. Luca is actually the crown princess, and she's also sent to that colony to help squash the rebellion in order to prove that she is ready to take the throne. So we follow these two women. We especially follow Terrain's inner struggle because, of course, she has been doctrinized her entire life to fight for the Empire, but now she's back to where she grew up, where she was born. So that's, of course, the main focus here, but I did really enjoy how this sapphic romance was also established in the book and to follow the feelings that we have between the two women in the sapphic romance. So yes, highly recommend, especially also if you like the colonial aspect, of course, and if you like internal struggles in characters. If you're looking for a straight up romance book, don't pick this one up. But if everything else also sounds interesting to you, I do think that you will love it. And then next up, of course, if I am going to talk about some fancy romance books, I need to mention Juliette Merlier. This book, Daughter of the Forest, is the first one in the Seven Waters series, and this is also my favorite book of all time. Now, in this trilogy, we do have an overarching plot that doesn't really have anything to do with the romance, but in each of the books, we follow a different female member of the Seven Waters family, and in each of the books, the romance plot is very upfront. It's the main plot. This is definitely a fantasy romance series. In the first one, we follow Sorka, and this is a Six Swans retelling. So it's a fairy tale retelling. It's beautifully written, and this has one of the slowest burn romances in history, but it's also my favorite romance ever. So if you want more of that, pick up this series. What I also like is because you follow different main characters, yes, this is a series, but each of them can be read as a standalone, and that's something that I always appreciate. Now, I do want to put a very big warning here that you do have a very graphic rape scene in this book. So if that's something that you have difficulties with, know that going in. But I do think that it was handled with care. Now, if you like Juliette Merlier, I think that you will also like Signy Pike. And this is The Lost Queen. This is the first book in the Lost Queen trilogy. These first two are out currently. The second one is The Forgotten Kingdom. The third one will probably come out in 2023. This is also an historical fantasy book, just like the Seven Waters series by Juliette Merlier, but I do think that the romance is not to the forefront as much as Juliette Merlier's works. So if you like something that definitely has a romance subplot, that is historical fantasy, that feels the same as Juliette Merlier's work with nature-based magic and a very whimsical writing style, then pick this one up, but don't expect the same amount of romance. In this one we have a forbidden romance, which, of course, I am going to really enjoy. And in this one, we actually follow the sister of the historical figure on whom Merlin was based upon. So that's quite interesting in my opinion. So again, a book that takes place in the early medieval England. In the second book, we have inclusion of the Picts, which is something that I really enjoyed. So yes, highly recommend this one as well, especially if you've read a lot of Juliette Merlier and you're looking for a similar author. Next up, I have a book that blew me away last year, and that has one of my favorite romances of all time, but talking too much about that would spoil part of the book, so I can't do that. And that is The Binding by Bridget Collins. So I'm just going to tell you what the main premise of the book is. In this one, we follow Emmet. Emmet is going to be a binder, and in this world, a binder is a people who binds people's memories into books. Now, we know that something bad happened in Emmet's past, but we don't really know what exactly. So throughout the book, we have this sort of tension. Is this going to be having future repercussions? Are we going to learn what happened exactly? And then around the halfway point of the book, we have a flashback and more is revealed. Now, if you want to have a beautiful romance, I would suggest picking this one up. But you need to find everything else around it also interesting, because for the majority of the book, this is definitely not romance-centered. So if anything that I talked about sounds interesting, pick it up. I know that a lot of people don't like it because it's incredibly slow. It is, but it's also super beautiful. So you win some, you lose some. And to be honest, I don't think that a slow book is a bad quality per se. Slow books can be amazing and the slow pacing can be deliberate, and I do think that that's the case for this one. Now, all of the books that I've mentioned up until this point are quite low on the smut parameter. That's not the case for the next series that I'm going to recommend, and that's of course the Akatar series by Sarah J. Maas. I think that most people who read fantasy romance have heard of this series, but I do want to say that I actually quite enjoyed the story in itself as well. However, if you don't like romance, that's the whole pillar of this series. In this one we follow Fair, and this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling where Fair needs to go to the fairy kingdom and live with one of these fairies. This is very much enemies to lovers type of fantasy, type of romance, but I do think that the second one greatly improves the entire series. The first one is okay, and it's definitely okay if you like romance, because then I feel you are able to forgive a lot of weaknesses in the book, but then the second one really is better in characterization as well, and you do have some twists here that I really enjoyed. So yes, pick it up, and especially if you want to have a little bit more smut. Now, I did already talk about the Juliette Marillier series, but I still wanted to mention the Birthday Chronicles by her. So like the Seven Waters series, in each of these books we follow a different main character, but unlike the Seven Waters series, in the first two books the main character is a woman, but in the third one it is a man. And I do think that Juliette Marillier writes the male perspective in a romance fantasy quite well. So if you're looking for something like this, I would highly recommend this trilogy. Now, all of Juliette Marillier's works are historical fantasy, but I do think that this is a little bit more than most of those, because in this one we follow Bride, King of the Picts, who was an actual person in history, and some of the battles that she talks about in this book are also historically accurate. But of course it's still Juliette Marillier, so in each of the books we have a strong romance plot that's really in the forefront. In the first one we have a friends to lovers trope, we have a very slow burning romance, and we also have a forbidden romance. It's one romance, but it's all of those three. And I thought that this was very sweet. But my favorite one was actually the third book, where we have the male perspective. So yes, highly recommend this one, even though I would suggest first picking up the Seven Waters trilogy, and if you like that, then continue to this one, because it is a more dense read. Then next up I have a trilogy that's very fairy tale-esque, very whimsical, and I do think that if you like Juliette Marillier's works, you will like this trilogy as well. However, the romance is not as upfront, it takes very much a backseat. So if you're looking for that, highly recommend. And that is the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden, the first book being The Bear and the Nightingale. So in this one we follow Vasha. Vasha lives in a small village that's in the middle of the Russian woods. It's very secluded, it's very cold, perfect to pick up in winter. It's actually one of my winter recommendations. And in this one we do have a romance, but it actually takes the entire trilogy to completely blossom, and I think that that's very fitting. It's a very small subplot, but every time that you read about it, you're completely invested. So yes, highly recommend, especially if you're looking for a romance that's a little bit more on the side. Next up, I'm very surprised that I have a Brandon Sanderson novel on this list, but that is Warbreaker. Now, Brandon Sanderson is not the best in writing romance. However, in Warbreaker, he wrote a beautiful and sweet romance, and I do really liked this one. Now, if you're looking for a fancy romance where romance is the main plot, you're not going to be happy here. It's only 10% of the plot, but every time you read about it, it's just so sweet and so hopeful, and you just want to read more about it. So I do think that if you like Brandon Sanderson's work, if you like hard magic systems, if you like to have twist upon twist upon twist, but you also want to pick up a book that has some romance for this time of the year, this is the perfect one. It's also one of my favorite Brandon Sanderson novels, by the way, so any case, highly recommend. And then the last one that I have, and that is For the Wolf by Hannah Witten. This is the first book in the Wildwood duology. For the Throne, the second book and last one in the duology, comes out later this year. Now, this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling again. In this one we follow Red, and we do have an enemies to lovers romance here, and I do think that this was done quite well here. Now, it's not done as well as in some of the other books that I talked about, but still I really enjoyed it, and I do want to see how this evolves in the second book, which seems to be a Sleeping Beauty retelling, and I do think that there's going to be a romance there as well. Now, it does say on the front that this is a dark fantasy retelling, and I do agree with that. So maybe not perfect if you want to have a sweet romance. There are definitely some darker moments in here, but if that's something that you like and you want some romance into that, highly recommend this one. So these are some of the fantasy romances that I quite enjoyed and that I would recommend to you, depending on which degree of romance that you want to have in your fantasy books. Please let me know in the comments down below if you have any recommendations for me and if you are going to pick up a fantasy romance around this time of the year. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the video and see you next time. Bye!